Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Vega Insights. I'm Luke Bideaux, President and CEO of Vega Imaging Informatics. And with us today is Kevin Foley. Kevin is a certified imaging informatics professional who serves as a solutions architect for Medicom Technologies. And we've brought Kevin on today because over the past 5 years, he's been primarily focused on imaging data initiatives for research and development. I've worked with Kevin and I really respect and applaud everything that he's doing to help research institutions with their initiatives and working with their data. And Kevin really has a good handle on those research workflows and the systems that are used to assist those types of institutions achieve their goals in research and development. So, Kevin, it's great to have you on today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, for those of you out there listening that maybe aren't as familiar with imaging workflows and the systems that are used in imaging workflows in a research environment, let's start with that. So, Kevin, tell us how these imaging research workflows sort of differ from the day-to-day clinical workflows in the imaging space.
Yeah. So I think, and this is a really great question to start out with. So it's really important for institutions to be thinking about how they're incorporating research into their enterprise imaging strategies. So many of the tools and the resources that are out there are really designed for the clinical environment. So, and understandably so, right? Patient care is super important. No one's going to deny that. A lot of times, certainly there are many ways that we would want more interoperability. And that's something at Medicom that we care a lot about. But compared to research workflows, clinical workflows are highly integrated. They're standardized. They're often replicable in ways that the research workflows are very different. And that's really because the systems were designed for clinical care and not for research. So I think a lot of times in the research space, we're working with tools that were, really designed for clinical care. You're pulling data from an archive that's designed to store images that were designed for patient care. So and the databases that we pull from now, they may be tagged with analytical purposes as well, but it's sort of like pulling all of these sort of disparate things that an institution might have to do a research workflow that in many cases, I mean, it's changing now. I think folks are really understanding the value of their own data and what they can do with it. But in some ways, it's been a little bit of an afterthought, right? So I think that's sort of a big high level difference. And I think that might be true across the board. It's going to certainly differ at every institution, and the type of institution matters, of course. So if you're a big IDN network like HCA, research is maybe not as important as it is at a place like the Mayo Clinic or UVA Health, UNC Health. So the way that these things shape out at different institutions is also different. Well, you might think that an AMC might have a better plan for research, but if anybody that's watching this or listening to this has ever worked at an academic medical center, you might know that there's the medical center side and then there's the academic side. And those are really, they might share an umbrella from an institutional perspective, but they often operate separately with separate budgets, separate initiatives. So I think at a high level, a lot of the clinical workflows are more highly integrated than the research ones are. Even within a single institution, research workflows may differ wildly depending on who's doing the research. If it's a certain PI in a lab has an initiative they want pushed, they might often get their way with it. Whereas things, again, tend to maybe be a little bit more standardized at a clinical level. So, yeah, happy to
Yeah.
expand more
Well,
on that.
that's a really interesting perspective that, it's typically like on the clinical side, from what I've seen, the larger the institution, the more you would expect out of a streamlined workflow and, complex systems that are highly integrated. But from a research perspective, that's not always the case. As you mentioned, the organization may be a large organization, but if their focus isn't research and they dabble around in research, their workflows and systems may be pretty rudimentary compared to maybe a smaller organization but has a higher focus on research, right?
I think that's definitely true, and to some degree, it makes sense. The larger the institution, the harder it is to manage it at scale. And I really do think a lot of the systems that researchers are pulling from are the systems that are dedicated. The workflows are based on systems that are dedicated to clinical care. So there is sort of this push and pull there with, okay, I might be a IIP that's working as a PACS analyst, and I'm also being tasked with pulling some images for de-identification. Sometimes with an IIP, that's where it ends, right? Is, oh, I've de-identified the data, I've pushed it to the location that they requested. What do they do with it from there? And I think in a lot of cases in research labs, anybody that's been in academia knows that the grad students are really the powerhouse behind a lot of things. So you can have a grad student that's, working in a lab for 3, 4, 5 years, building out a really nice homegrown system. Well, then they get their PhD and they move on and into their own professional life. And then who is there to manage that workflow? So you end up with, okay, maybe this was a great internal tool that was really designed for workarounds as opposed to kind of cutting directly to the points. And then those people leave, and what do you do? There's no institutional support. And there's often not enough communication maybe between the medical center and the researchers driving their certain initiatives.
It's interesting. As you're talking, I'm thinking about, the nice thing about clinical workflows is that we have standards and we have frameworks, right? So if one person leaves, or even if one vendor goes out of business or whatever, you know exactly what you need to replace. There are standards, there are frameworks to follow. On the research side, are there standards to follow? Or are there like organizations like the IHE, for instance, that implement standard research workflows and frameworks for people to follow? Or is it a little bit different than on the clinical side?
And I'll admit I'm not entirely sure the extent to which those IHE protocols are followed. And I think again it might depend on the type of institution. My mind goes immediately to these academic medical centers where the research is really occurring outside of the places that are even involved with IHE. Right? They're solely on an academic track of figuring out, okay, I want to publish my research. I want to do more research. It's separate from the patient care journey altogether, right? I mean, it has indirect effects, of course, but not in the same way. So I think to answer your question about standards, no, I think a lack of standards has been a big problem. Now, of course, we can still rely on things in the DICOM standard, very useful. But if you're, say if you're doing research in neuroradiology, you're not even working with DICOM files at that point. You'll be working with NIFTY files, which you can convert DICOM to NIFTY, but you introduce all of these other elements to it that that are really different from the standards that exist in the clinical care world.
I think it'd be interesting just to talk through a high level workflow at an organization that's got a fairly sound workflow in place for research. How does it work? Walk us through kind of an end to end workflow with a research initiative. Could we do that?
Yeah. So in an ideal state, it would be great if you had awesome communication and understanding of the value of the data that's being stored. I think that's a almost a baseline requisite for an ideal situation is that the institution really understands the value of the data that they sit on. I mean, if you want to talk about things related to community health, you have your patient population available to you if you can de-identify that data, right? I mean, it doesn't get closer to that. I think you're very familiar with the issues of selection bias in imaging research, where a handful of locations have elected to de-identify and use their data for research purposes, and it skews the results for populations that don't match that data. So I think that is a baseline understanding and agreement between, among the institution to say research matters. We've got a lot of data. It could be a huge benefit to our patients. So from a philosophical standpoint, I think that's the place to start. And then from there, and this is something we're really focused on at Medicom with our research tools, is how do you bridge that gap? How do you make interoperability happen between the clinical side, the PAC side, and the research side? What is the flow of images from the PACs to a research environment? So in an ideal world, an institution would have a whole archive dedicated to research. And this is something that we've partnered with some institutions that we're helping them work through right now of they want to de-identify as many images as they can put them into a research packs so that they can get in there and have folks not worry about some of these regulations, or the data is clean to work with, right? So I think that is a huge thing of having the mission understood at the high level. Having a research packs would be awesome, or an archive, because I think we want to maybe also think about how are we going to be pulling in pathology data? How are we going to be pulling in, I mentioned Nifty earlier. How are you going to pull in different file formats? I think that's all super important for an ideal setting. And then, governance is always a tricky thing. Who has the right permissions to view and access the data? Because, IIPs can't do it all. A PACS analyst can't be responsible for clinical protocols or workflows, as well as helping each individual researcher get data in the exact format that they want it in the same way that they want it in. So you need folks that have the right skill sets and tools involved in this process that are helping bridge that gap between the medical center and the academic institution. So this is where some things around database knowledge are really important to understand, where does our data live? Now, in an ideal environment, you've got a data lake where you can just go pull the data right away without having to think about it. Now, that we're talking ideal environments, and so that's often not the case. So you really also need people who can troubleshoot, who can go and say, well, this data lives over here. Well, okay, this data is in the RIS, but then we need the pathology information, and that lives in a different part of an EMR. Well, how do you combine all of those things? Are the reports de-identified? All of those things. So, of course, de-identification tools really matter. And, to Medicom's horn, we've got a really robust de-identification tool that de-identifies not only the DICOM metadata, but it can work on pixel scrubbing. And we also have some tools that work really well on report text. So get in there and anonymize the report text so that it can also be used. That's where a lot of the value in these things lie, in pathology reports and radiology reports. So having the right tools in place to be able to access, de-identify, and then funnel that data to where it needs to go. So again, it's going to vary from every institution what that ideal environment looks like. But to me, the ideal endpoint would be to research packs.
That's a lot of great information. I want to try to chime in before I forget some of the points. But I mean, first of all, it sounds like there are some organizations that have a research PACS and some that don't, right? And that sounds like a pretty foundational difference between an organization that's serious about a research architecture and preparing themselves for success in research versus one that's just kind of dabbling around in it. But of course, research packs, I mean, it's hard enough for most organizations to pay for their own packs with the storage costs and the licensing costs and everything. So the concept of kind of doubling that cost, and I know research packs can be very expensive. Some of them out there, 2, 3 times the amount you might pay for licensing fees than a regular clinical packs. So like, doubling your volumes over to the research packs may not be financially possible for a lot of organizations. But at least having the system there so that on demand you could move things into it on a project basis. That sounds like, something that organizations need to seriously consider if they want to scale their research initiatives. And then I thought it was interesting, you talked about, well, who's going to be in charge of overseeing the integration between the clinical systems and the research systems? Who's going to manage the data? Now, Kevin, you're a certified imaging informatics professional, and I know you've been successful. You mentioned having database skills. That's something that I think, IT, database management is part of the test content outline to become a SIP. Do you see the certified imaging informatics professional sort of being the target type of candidate to lead these organizations to success with their research initiatives? Or would it be some other type of role, like a radiologist or a physicist? Like what what types of skill set and role would you recommend for organizations out there looking to scale in that area?
Yeah, I do think it's the IIP that is better suited to be doing it, right? I mean, they would have to have some ownership to be able to make decisions, and I'm sure things would be done in accordance with policy and everything. But yeah, I mean, IIPs know the data, right? They know it from many different levels, whether they're doing a hanging protocol or maybe a lot of IIPs may not have a lot of database experience or know how to do things in say SQL or Python. I actually came into the IIP world from a kind of a different background where I had more of that database experience than I did say the radiology experience. So some of those skills I already had coming into it and had to maybe learn things a little bit backwards from how some IIPs learn them. But the good news is there are so many tools out there now that can help you learn database skills, how to learn SQL or Python or different ways of managing the data. If you're able to get some of the data, the metadata out of the environment in which it lives, to query it, however you need to do that, right? I mean, the AI tools will help you write scripts that, people 10 years ago needed to be a master in SQL to know how to write. Well, now you can do it faster. And I'm sure you've heard this before that in many cases, IIPs are maybe better suited to leverage AI to build those types of solutions. And I think that's because they know the data. I think that's the most crucial piece is you have to understand what data elements you're working with and how they fit into the bigger research picture. That's, if you're going to run into any issue troubleshooting with the data, because you will every time, that you have to understand how the data is structured. And once you understand how it exists and what you want the end state to be, well, then you have the tools available to you. Now, I'm not saying go, do your vibe coding and freewheel it and let it AI's doing it all. No, you need to understand what's going on and teach yourself with AI. But those tools are out there. And I think that's a great way for IIPs to expand that skill set to kind of bridge that same gap of like, yeah, I think IIPs are the right people because they know the data.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, the concepts are pretty simple. Have the right systems in place, have the right tools, have the right people.
Have the
So
funding.
I think, yeah, and to do that, you got to have the right funding. But I think at many organizations, somewhere along the way, either it gets overcomplicated or they lose their way on what's important. And it's sort of the same story in every division, every institution. Find the right systems to achieve your workflow needs and get the right people in place, and you can be successful. And I think it's a great thing for the IIP community to be aware of that there are opportunities that exist outside of the clinical systems. And I would say, in the space of research and development for AI and emerging technologies, it's a growing avenue for career development to get into the research world and sharpen your skills with database management and data management to be able to be successful in some of these roles. So that's an exciting thing, I think, for the IIP community to be aware of, and for some of you out there listening to this that maybe have some of that more technical background. I think it's something to seriously consider for your career growth. Because I'm interested to hear your perspective, Kevin. You've worked with so many institutions in your role. How many of them would you say are properly equipped with the right professionals that understand the data that's being worked with and are in a position to be successful with their systems?
I think you use the word properly equipped. And I think that is put a three underlines under that word. Very, very few. I think many of these organizations certainly have people that are very capable of working on these things, but they have 10 million other clinical focused things they need to focus on, which takes priority, right? So when you have your best human capital that's too spread thin, right? They just don't have the time. Research is comes second to clinical care. It's just how it is. And so if you're spread thin, that's the thing that tends to fall off the most, right? And you see a lot of places turning to places like Vega for the okay, well, how can we don't know how to do this. Can you guys help us do this? Right. So in a lot of cases, I think they have the right people. They just don't have enough of.
Yeah, and it's the same on the clinical side too. I had opportunity to do a lot of traveling earlier in my career and observe different workflows, different roles trying to be used to manage the workflows. And yeah, there's a shortage of qualified imaging informatics professionals out there. And unfortunately, I haven't seen an upward trend in recent years in this field. And I don't quite know why, with all the buzz about the promise of technology and imaging for the future. And you'd think that maybe we'd see a huge influx of certified imaging informatics professionals, people entering the field. I do know that Sim showed some great numbers of increase in the number of members. So we're seeing a lot more folks getting interested in educating themselves and being involved in the industry, which is great. But both Kevin and I can attest to in the real world there is a shortage out there in terms of capable professionals that can lead institutions to success, both on the research and the clinical side. So let's dig into a little bit on the challenges because, if there are many challenges that exist on the research workflows, and I think maybe there are some organizations that don't fully understand what those challenges are, and maybe they're not aware of some of the bad positions that their organizations might be putting themselves in by not having the right people and tools in place to help them. What would you say is probably the number one challenge or pitfall that an organization has when they're trying to do imaging data research related initiatives?
Gosh, have to choose one. I can't help but I have to go with the funding. If anybody watching this, listening to this, has been involved with research, the last couple years, funding has been tenuous at best, let's say. So, uh, there's a lot more underneath of that answer. But if an institution doesn't think that it's worth the cost, you mentioned earlier, a research packs can be sometimes wildly expensive, too expensive for an institution to take on. If you don't have the funding to support the research, to support the initiatives, to support the best in class tools that are out there to de-identify your data, then it's almost a non-starter in some sense, or you're fully reliant on the resources that you have using open source tools that are out there and can work, but they're manual, they're messy, they don't do the sorts of things from an interoperability standpoint that institutions would want them to do. So I would think that funding has to be top of mind, even at institutions where clinical care is excellent and research is also excellent. You still have to justify every dollar spent. So I think that's a big thing. I think another barrier, if I may expand on this a little bit, I think governance is also really important of who has access to the data. I mentioned earlier the split between an academic research institution academic medical center where you might have researchers working solely on an academic side. They're not clinicians at all. And they have data that they want to work with, or they know about data that they want to work with, but they're not credentialed by the medical center to access the data to be able to de-identify it. I think that's a huge gap that a lot of institutions deal with, of the people that can access the data, IIPs, are overloaded with work and can't get the resources to those academic people that need them. So I think those are, I have to talk about funding because it's so important. And then I would say the governance piece is the next piece, and
So,
access
so let
to
me
data.
ask about each one of these. Let's start with the funding piece. So, where does the funding typically come from for research? From what you've seen, are most of these research initiatives funded by big pharma that's trying to do some research on something, so they partner with a research institution? Is it the government? Is it the institution itself trying to set money aside and taking money from one pocket and the other, put it in the other? Where does the money come from to fuel most of the research in the imaging space?
Yeah, so from my understanding, most of it's coming from grants. Now you could have a grant from the federal government, like National Science Foundation, or you could have a grant from a private institution, right, like the Gates Foundation, something like that. Just two big name kind of places that fund this sort of thing. And in either case, it's academics that are going out and writing grant proposal. How can I get this grant money for my research? How am I going to justify it? So I think mostly that's where it comes from. To your point of sort of industry sponsored things, they are out there, and I think especially at bigger name institutions, places that can draw more of a bit of like a Duke or a Mayo Clinic, like those are going to get more of those pharma type support than maybe smaller institutions might, right? Because it looks good for both sides. So I think you'll see researchers turning more towards industry as sources of federal funding are maybe uncertain or are drying up. I don't think it's going to be that way forever necessarily, but you definitely hear academics talk about, well, okay, well, who else can we partner with to drive some of these, research initiatives?
So, I mean, I'd like to see more innovation happen, more research on imaging data because the potential is there. But as you mentioned, if the funding isn't there to do the research, then the whole thing is a non-starter. Now, you mentioned that most of the funding comes from grants that could be government-based grants or some sort of privately funded grants. Uh,
And to be sure, there's variation, right? And institutions themselves do outwardly, and they'll say it, and it's true. They want to support research, right? And many of them do. So it's not like it's academics fighting against the medical center. I think it's oftentimes of even when there is the shared vision, it still comes down to, well, who's going to pay for it?
yeah, yeah, it's interesting. And Vega has worked with many innovative companies, but these are corporate entities mostly that are creating, fantastic AI solutions for the imaging space, do many different useful things. And a lot of those companies are privately funded, right? They've raised money through private equity or whatever the case may be to be able to fund the research and development that they're doing. And I think if you look around like at the RSNA AI showcase area, large majority of those companies are the privately funded corporate entities that are doing most of the innovative work in this space. And I think it's strange because you have a lot of talent in the research institutions, and it's not even close in terms of the output of commercial solutions that are getting adopted and actually used in the real world, between the private corporate entities versus the academic medical centers and those that are trying to do things. And so it's an interesting situation. I don't have the answers on how we can help the research institutions do more. It sounds like, your experience is that it's challenged financially first and foremost for many of them. And so it seems like that's an area of focus if we want to see more innovation coming from them. Then you mentioned governance, that they might have the data within their institution that they need to do the research. Let's say they even have the funding, but if they have no way to access the data, either due to policies or don't have the resources internally to make it happen, then they can't move forward. What's your experience been with those types of research institutions that either they can't get to the data that they have or they need more? And then do you have any experience with those looking to third parties to supplement the data needs that they have, or do they strictly look internally most of the time?
Yeah, and again, it's going to depend on institution, and I really like how you kind of pivoted this a little bit from, well, it's not just people in academia doing research and driving innovation, right? A lot of it is happening in this sort of private industry world, and it's spot on, right? So I think for those types of individuals, the more data they can get, the better, and it's they want it from diverse populations and spread across. I mean, if you're looking at just within the United States, they want diverse data, right? They want, in the truest sense of the words, they want, data that is going to be representative of the populations that they're designing tools to help. So I think in that case, you have to have sort of a third party input to be able to help you aggregate that data across institutions. So I'm not sure if I quite answered your question there. I think institutions do struggle to pull this data together themselves. As you know, a lot of this data lives in different systems that we wish it could all, seamlessly pull together. But then you add in the chronological factor of, well, in 2015, we migrated over to this system. And so all the data before then lives over in this format, and now it's over here. So aggregating the data together, I think, is really important for whether you're looking at a research institution or you're somebody working for a venture capital funded startup that's trying to design the next breast cancer AI detection tool, right?
Yeah, I think in my experience, we've worked with far more private corporations in helping them get the data they need. And I wonder, you know, why, if these research institutions have such a hard time getting the data that they need from their own institution, why don't they look to third parties to help supplement their needs, especially if they do have the aspirations to create something that could eventually be commercialized and adopted around the world? They're going to want to get more diversity in their data, like the private corporation's attitude is. And that attitude is fueled also by the FDA and their requirements on diverse data. But, it's an interesting one. And it seems like, maybe there's some room for improvement there.
I mean, that's one of the areas that I see of, what could really take things to another level. I would love to see more sort of, I mean, interdisciplinary or, academics working with private companies. I think that's really where I don't know how much of it is happening right now. I can't speak to it as an expert of, oh, there's X amount of positive relationships going between these companies and this institution. But you want to talk about funding being an issue? Well, here's partially a solution. And maybe institutions need to see the fruits of that labor develop, right? And then there'd be a clear path of, a lot of things in academia are, this is the way that it's been done. And so this is the way that we do it. This is our data, not their data. We're here to serve patients. They're trying to make money. I think that's often something you might hear from an academic of, no, we're not involved in that part. We care about the patient journey. And I think you can have people care about patients, and the type of work that these private companies are doing end up helping patients maybe more than maybe some academics are realizing. And I'm sure clinicians are probably well aware of how the developments in different tools affect patient care, maybe more than somebody doing their specific research that's very narrowly focused. And I think that is a huge opportunity, future collaboration. I would love to see more academic institutions partnering with private companies to really up the innovation and development on both sides.
And then you and we've been in the trenches with executing these projects. Maybe you've achieved your access to the data one way or another, and now you're ready to start trying to work with the data. De-identification is definitely not an easy task when it comes to imaging data. And I fear that many people out there don't recognize the difference between imaging data and, let's say, textual data from the EHR, right? It reports from various places out of the EHR. So when it comes down to it and they're trying to work with this imaging data, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you're seeing out there that folks with less expertise might run into?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things is, how are you de-identifying the data? Or, you'll hear the term anonymization and de-identification sometimes thrown around synonymously, where anonymization is really like, if you're thinking of the DICOM metadata perspective, you're just going to wipe a tag or replaced it with value anonymized, something like that. Whereas de-identification, sometimes referred to as pseudo-anonymization, really is more about replacing the identified values with de-identified versions. So I think a lot of times when institutions struggle to de-identify their data in an efficient way, they're doing it in a way that you're losing the longitudinal aspect of the data, right? If you're tracking things like breast health care, you want to look at the time between a screening exam and a diagnostic exam, followed by a biopsy and then the pathology results. Well, the longitudinality matters. The interval between those exams could be very important. And I think the same goes for, take any other modality. I think longitudinality is huge. So, and that's something that we're really proud at Medicom is that our tool does very effectively replace identifiers with identifiers that allow you to keep track. We're going to shift the dates and we're going to do it in a way that you're not going to be able to unmask it, but it's going to keep that the interval between studies consistent so you can track patients longitudinally. And that also helps institutions, if you want to go pull, okay, this data has already been de-identified. Now we can go use it. Or has this patient been de-identified before? If you're just anonymizing it or if you're doing it in sort of an ad hoc way, you might be wasting resources by de-identifying the same study over and over and over if you're not able to keep a good track of how you're de-identifying data. Is it going to a log anywhere that you can source it from? So I think those are all important aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. You could do a lot of things wrong pretty easily with trying to de-identify imaging data. And the DICOM standard defines so many different DICOM tags, and there are different VR requirements and things for each tag. And, it goes, oftentimes we'll get data from folks that think they know how to de-identify imaging data, and there's so much cleanup. It would have been better if we just got the original so we can start from scratch. You have to handle the UIDs to make sure everything's still following the same hierarchy, all the same transformed study instance UIDs and series instance UIDs and SOP instance UIDs are managed properly. Got all sorts of different attribute types that need to be handled differently. Like you mentioned, you can't just throw the word anonymized into whatever tag you want. It will completely break the compliance to the DICOM standard, and then viewers and downstream systems may not be able to handle those objects. We've lived it. We understand the challenges that exist, and the importance then of having the right tools and personnel, involved in managing these things. And so, with our limited amount of time, I'd ask if we could maybe explore what sort of promising technology do you see in the future that research institutions should be paying attention to and considering bringing into their technology stack?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, I'm going to try to say, well, Medicom's research platform would be a huge help because it's one of the ways that institutions can at scale de-identify their data, as I mentioned, in a way that allows them to track patient journeys in a de-identified format. I think that's huge. I think the other tools in conjunction with that, and this is stuff that we're always interested in at Medicom, and I think folks at various institutions are also interested in. I mean, AI has obviously changed the game. So much of the data that people need, researchers need, I know you know this well, you pull out of a radiology or a pathology report. And the direction that LLMs are going and that natural language process is going, we're getting better able to not only anonymize those reports, but pull the relevant information out of those reports where, somebody says IDC as opposed to invasive ductal carcinoma, right? Now that's an easy example, but the way that physicians might write out things in a report is going to depend on that physician, that institution, right? There's wild differences between them. So I find a lot of promise in all these developments in AI of being able to aggregate this free text data in a way that makes it so that you can work with it in conjunction with the DICOM data, right? So that you can pull these different parts of a patient's clinical journey together far more efficiently than you might have been able to do otherwise. And I think that's absolutely crucial.
I think that might be a good stopping point, for today. I learned a lot, and hopefully everyone out there did as well. Just to kind of recap on some of the things that we talked about here. First of all, We talked about how research workflows and systems can differ significantly compared to clinical workflows and systems. And organizations need to understand that if they're doing research initiatives in the imaging space or they plan to, they need to be planning systems and workflows that can facilitate those differences. And then the people, right? The human resources that are involved in this. We talked about how the imaging informatics professional today is probably the best suited to be placed into a role of managing these research workflows and systems and helping the researchers be successful in what they're doing. And I know this is something that Medicom specializes in, both the technology and professional services with this. And Vega as well has a professional service division. So sometimes getting help from third parties is not a bad thing. And, if in some ways, it can even be more cost efficient to bring in the experts to take care of things that you need a little help with internally. And so the professional component to these types of workflows cannot be understated. We talked about a number of challenges that can happen, especially if you don't have the right systems and people in place. Challenges with how you're going to fund your initiatives, how you're going to govern them, and then how you're going to execute them with some of the challenges around de-identification, data management, and a little bit of promise for the future with AI and how LLMs are able to do fantastic things when it comes to performing discovery on the data that you have, helping automate workflows that were previously very manual in nature and help tie things together. And so I know Medicom is dedicated to innovation and can help automate workflows and help organizations with their systems and integrations to be successful in this area. And definitely Vega is interested to partner with any organization that is doing data curation. We have a lot of opportunities to collaborate on. So we're excited to have those conversations. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today and listening to our perspectives on this. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or would like to learn more. So thanks again and have a great day.
Thank you, Luke.